Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Hello. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Donna Lucas, and I'm welcoming you here on behalf of the Public Policy Institute of California's Board of Directors. Thanks for coming. We are so pleased to present this program today, featuring our distinguished leader. Our distinguished leaders. The other leaders are on their way. They're doing what they should be doing, which is governing, and then they're going to be over here. But right now we have our wonderful Assembly Speaker. But our leaders today will be Senate Pro Tem Kevin de León, Senate Republican Leader Patricia Bates, and Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon. And what a privilege it is to have you all here today. This is part of the PPIC Speaker Series on California's future, and we'd like to thank our sponsors for this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your program, but they're also up here, and you can see we have 2 slides of these, and we want to thank our great sponsors for doing this. This series is also sponsored by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, groups of individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Funding from our sponsors and donors make programs like today and your lunch available. So thank you to all of our sponsors. So before we begin, a few housekeeping items. If you have a phone, please turn it off so you're not interrupting this wonderful conversation. Also, after today's program, you will get an email from us, and we would love to hear your opinion about the program. So please take a few minutes just to respond to that, because we're always trying to improve our programs. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to our president, Mark Baldassare.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Donna, and welcome to all of you on State of the State Day. And what a privilege to have on the stage today our Assembly Speaker, Anthony Rendon, who has been in that leadership position since 2016 and represents a district in Los Angeles. And last year, at around this time, we had the privilege of talking about the plans for the coming year. This is really a critical moment for the legislature to think about what are the most important issues. And we agreed in advance to just raise one question, and then we'll go from there. But what do you see as 1 or 2 of the most important issues in the current legislative session?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me. It's good to be back. Last year when I was here, it was the 2 Republican leaders and the 2 Democratic leaders. Now, today I'll speak for the Republicans, the Democrats, the Senate. I think
good.
If Ms. Bates and Mr. Daly were here, they'd probably say that the Democratic ideas clearly won out. And if Mr. de León were here, he'd say that the Assembly is clearly the better house. He'd say it in far more words than that. But it's good to be back. I think this year first of all, we had a tremendous year last year. If you think about all that we accomplished with respect to infrastructural development, obviously, with respect to housing and our climate change efforts, it was really a banner year. Last year was a banner year. And I think some of that was obscured, and rightfully so, by the sexual harassment crises that developed in the fall that we knew we always had as a society, that was sort of lingering underneath the surface. So I think when we start this year, we have to start with that. We have to start with the issue of sexual harassment, not only changing our policies and procedures in state government, but also changing our societal culture. With respect to policies and procedures, the committee that Laura Friedman in our House is chairing is a committee that I established last June. And I established that committee last June because when I took over the speakership, I realized that our sexual harassment policies and procedures had not been updated since 1993. I'm really bad at math, but I think that's a good 13 years, 14 years where they hadn't been updated. So
24.
I'm sorry?
24, yeah.
No. Oh, really? Clearly.
I'm a pollster, so numbers, come naturally to me. So, yeah.
In spite of that, we have a good state budget.
That's right. Yeah.
We hadn't updated our policies and procedures in 24 years, like I said. But in addition to that, it's about culture. It's really about changing the institution, the way we do business within the institution, the way we sort of conceptualize our interactions. And we're working hard first on the assembly side with Ms. Friedman leading that committee, but also jointly with the Senate, with a committee that just started their efforts yesterday, a joint committee efforts to start looking at those efforts. In addition to that, I mean, there's plenty of unfinished business from last year. Obviously, oversight. I've been in office for 5 years now. That number's accurate. I know that. I've been in office for 5 years now, and I've in my short time here, I've lived through the Parks Department crisis. I lived through the PUC crisis. We obviously have a tremendous need to provide oversight as a state. And I think with the extension of term limits to 12 years, we really have this opportunity to do that. So in addition to those issues, there's issues relating to poverty, which I've worked on in the nonprofit sector for about 20 years. Bail reform is a huge issue that was one of the few things that was left undone last year. So our work is cut out for us.
Terrific. When you talk about changing culture, my training is a sociologist. You're trained as a political scientist. That's a big ask, right? And obviously, this is very important societal issue, and it's also essential for an institution that's built on trust and mutual respect. And somehow that was obviously not front and center in a way it should have been, given what we've learned about not just one but many cases of sexual harassment. And how do you think about making the kind of change that's going to be lasting in this case? Right.
Well, obviously, policies and procedures are about sort of what's on paper, but
that's where you start.
That's where you start. But culture is about actual people. Yeah. I think to a large extent, it's about making sure that the right people are coming into the building, the right people are getting elected to office. There were some really dark and depressing days in November and December as this crisis unfolded, and I remember being up here. It was December 21st. I was up here at the height of the crisis, and it seemed like every day there was something dire was happening. And I remember looking around the speaker's office and thinking that as difficult as it is, I'm glad to be here at this moment. I'm glad to be here at a moment when I can effectuate change and lasting change. And when you look at people like Laura Friedman, who's been chairing our efforts, you look at people like Eloise Reyes, who's been great on this issue. We have a number of our members who are trying to effectuate change, and I think it's really about the people who are in the building, and also about mindfulness and awareness. There have obviously been some egregious examples of harassment and violence in Sacramento. But I think just as important, it's about the smaller incidences that we can't ignore anymore. And I think that's ultimately where you change culture.
Thank you. Well, in thinking about the 5 years since you arrived here, I know that one of the lifelong or career-wise issues has been for you poverty and the alleviation of poverty and programs that will help those who are in poverty, as well as our economy is doing. As much as we have a budget surplus this year, that more reflects how people on the very top end are doing in California. Rates of poverty remain very high in California. My guess is when PPIC next looks at income inequality, we're going to see that that's grown in our state as the wealthy have become much more wealthy. How do you see us most effectively dealing with the issue of poverty?
Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, we've done a lot. And the fact that we've done a lot and not moved the needle to anywhere close to the extent that we want to move the needle says something about how profound the problem is. It also says something about how long we've ignored the problem. This is something that I've been committed to as a career, 20 years in the nonprofit sector, early childhood education, gang reduction programs. I really believe as a provider of social services and now as someone involved in public policy, I honestly don't believe that there's any great mystery in terms of how to address it. It's about political will and political commitment and also stick-to-itiveness. It's about making sure that whether it's addressing housing affordability, whether it's addressing infrastructure, whether it's addressing the minimum wage or overtime issues, that we don't think that with a single signature on a line that we've somehow fixed everything and we can move on to the next shiny object. It's going to take a tremendous sustained effort. I told the story before about how I got involved in Sacramento, why I decided to run for office. I was working in early childhood education and our funding got cut by, collectively, $1.2 billion as a state. It's in early childhood education. It's very easy for me and for a lot of us to look at early childhood education, which we know has an impact on breaking the poverty cycle in families and in societies. It's very easy to look at our efforts over the last couple of years. We've reinvested $800 million in early childhood education over the last couple of years. And it's easy to look at that and think, yay, everything's great. Well, everything's great until you think about the fact that we eliminated $1.2 billion. We've only restored 2/3 of it. That's right. We've only restored 2/3 of it. Yet when I was running early childhood education programs, I had waiting lists of 700, 1,100 children and families. So the commitment that we had then was not enough, and we're not even back to where we were. So I think whether you're looking at wages, whether you're looking at early childhood education, low cost, high quality public education, which is something that we've traditionally done as a state, I think we have to make sure that those efforts are sustained.
So when you look at the budget surplus that we are talking about for this year and how the governor proposes to use the budget surplus, do you agree that with the money that needs to be set aside in the reserve, or do you think that some of these funds should be spent on programs that you think work for alleviating poverty, and how do you create that balance?
Yeah, well, I think you find a balance, and the answer is it's both. I think we're incredibly proud of our rainy day fund and our economic situation as a state in terms of our reserves. It's something we're quite proud of. And quite honestly, as Democrats, we probably don't tout enough. That being said, we know that, and you talked about it in your previous question, there are families that are suffering who need immediate change. And I think one thing that there were a couple of national reporters who were here yesterday, not to see me, but for the State of the State, for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and we did some interviews. And I think to a large extent, there's still a national perception that the divisions in California are along north and south boundaries, which I don't at all believe they are anymore. I think we all have a sense that the great sort of gap in California is one between east and west. And if you draw a straight line from Coachella to Riverside to Santa Barbara to Antelope Valley through the Central Valley, you see that's the great pockets of poverty. And along the coast, where there are some folks that aren't doing as well, we know that the economy is growing better there. So, I mean, I think we need to think about how we spend money, but also sort of the distribution, and to make sure that all Californians are benefiting from our economy.
Would you like to see a universal preschool?
Oh, yeah. I'd love to see universal
Okay.
preschool. Places like Oklahoma, Republican-dominated Oklahoma, have universal preschool. I think we are, as a state, as I think a lot of our individual providers in California are sort of at the cutting edge. But as a state, I think we're behind places like Oklahoma, places like Washington, and I would love to see universal preschool.
One of the features of the governor's budget proposal is increased funding for K through 12.
Yeah.
And continued emphasis on the local control funding formula, some more accountability requirements with that. Two-part question. Are we spending enough money on K through 12? And are we seeing progress with the local control funding formula?
No and yes. I don't think we're spending enough money as a state on K through 12 funding. I don't think we're spending enough money as a state.
Can you give me a sense of what in your view the shortfall might be and what we should be spending?
I think the overall, and just in general, I think the overall spending per pupil is lower than it should be, and it is lower than the majority of states. I also think we need to sort of look at the continuum of education. Not only did I talk about my support of universal preschool, but I'm a beneficiary of the community college system. I'm a beneficiary of the Cal State system. I'm a beneficiary of the UC system. I did all of that, all of California's public higher education system, and I ended up with about $5,000 in debt. The fact that I paid $283 as a freshman at Cal State Fullerton in 1988 versus what it costs now says a lot about our overall commitment to education, or lack thereof.
So if you think about the fact that we're going to need about 1.1 more college graduates by 2030 than we have today, according to the most recent PPIC estimates. How do you see us getting there? Obviously, the governor has talked about online education quite a bit, has that in the current budget, but that's going to be a pretty heavy lift. What do you think needs to be done in the higher education system to improve access and outcomes to that level?
Well, I had Chancellor Tim White in my office this morning. We talked about some of our members would like to see another Cal State in Chula Vista, another Cal State in Concord, another Cal State in Stockton. We know that our infrastructural system, our educational infrastructural system, was built for probably 1972 and not 2018. So I think that being said, you don't want to fund and then starve campuses. You don't want to open up new campuses and then not have the funds necessary to support those institutions. So I do think, like a lot of other things, I think it's going to take a renewed commitment to our Cal State and our UC system. I had dinner the other night with the president of PG&E. A good 50% of their workforce is going to retire good working class jobs, really good working class jobs, most of which require a couple of years of trade school or community college. I think we've ignored that. We're starting to address that on the assembly side through a select committee that we've had. But I think we really need to be forward looking. The master plan for higher education in this state was created a long time ago, I believe in the 60s, and that hasn't been looked at either. Yeah,
it's been a long time. So everything that you're describing, the needs, require more funding.
Yep.
And even with the budget surplus, we have, I would say, probably more funding than is currently available. The legislature and governor passed a transportation tax this last year that there are efforts underway to repeal it now. So where do you see the funding coming from? I don't think it's going to be coming from Washington. That's just a wild guess, right?
I'm thinking it's not either.
Yeah.
Given the tax reform bill that just passed, I think that's actually something that we're still kind of crunching the numbers on and trying to figure out We as a caucus have looked at a number of different avenues. Obviously, a services fee is something that's been kicked around. I saw my good friend Rudy Salas walk in earlier. He's probably really scared. Hello, Rudy. How are you? I'm not going to talk about an oil extraction fee around my friend from Bakersfield. That would just get him nervous. But we've looked at different avenues for additional revenue. But I really believe, and this is something that I discovered when I showed up 5 years ago. There is a need to overhaul our complete tax system in California. And my freshman year, the divisions between the progressives and the moderates were more profound and stark than they certainly are now. Those were some incredible battles. But where there was unanimity was around that idea of sort of overhauling our entire tax system, and that's something that I know they started to look at on the Senate side, and I think that overall as a state we need to look at as well.
So with the federal tax reform now in place in 2018, do you see this year as one in which the state of California should be looking at an overhaul of its tax system?
I think we have to be prudent. I think we still don't understand what the tax.
What are you looking to learn in crunching the numbers? What are your biggest questions about the federal tax reform?
The extent to which it's going to influence individual behavior. The extent to which individual Californians and California corporations are going to be hesitant to invest in the future. The extent to which foreign corporations are going to be hesitant to invest in the United States. I think those are the fundamental questions that we need to start with.
Those are big questions. It could take a while to figure that out, and it'll be based on modeling. Yeah. So in the meantime, keep everything in place with the current tax system?
There aren't, here in the second year of a 2-year cycle, there aren't, on our side anyway, any huge efforts underway to overhaul the tax system.
So I'm interested in also the fact that if I look at the state budget, there was a big increase in Medi-Cal.
Yep.
And Medi-Cal is now the largest health plan in California. All of this a result of the conditions, obviously earlier conditions we talked about, but also opportunities created for people to enroll through the Affordable Care Act. How do you see Medi-Cal funding going forward with the uncertainties we have at the federal level? How do we do that?
Well, I think last year's reinvestments in Medi-Cal, I think, were the culmination of a significant amount of effort. As long as I've been here, we were trying to sort of get over that hill. I think the governor, we've had preliminary conversations about this year, and I don't think there's going to be tremendous efforts to go much higher than there were. There's obviously tremendous uncertainty in our healthcare system as a nation and obviously as a state. So I think that's another area with respect to that particular funding stream. I think that's another area around which we're going to have to be cautious.
Well, what do you mean by cautious in this sense?
I don't see any huge additional reinvestments in Medi-Cal funding.
So you have been, as you mentioned, spent your career around poverty and alleviating poverty. This comes out in your commitments in education and what you've just described in terms of the Medi-Cal program. But at this point, you're not ready to move forward on single payer, or do you? What are your thoughts about the single payer system?
I had a feeling you'd ask.
I have to.
You should. I would.
Yeah.
I've long been supportive of single payer, and I'm supportive of universal health care. There was a particular bill, you may have heard of it, that emanated from the Senate last year, which was a fine piece of legislation, only that it was missing funding, a service delivery mechanism, a mention of the GAN limit, a mention of Proposition 98. a mention of the fact that we would have to get a federal waiver. So excluding everything relevant to delivering a single-payer system, it was a fine piece of legislation.
Oh, that's the definition of a politician, I guess, huh? Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. And so, where do you see the next steps around that?
Around single payer, we've had Dr. Jim Wood, who is a dentist, a medical provider, represents the North Coast in the Assembly. Dr. Joaquin Arambula, who's a emergency room physician and now represents Fresno in the Assembly. They have a joint committee, which I established before SB 562 was introduced, to look at how we would achieve universal health care in California. There are wide-ranging estimates of what the bill would cost, what a system would cost, anywhere between $400 billion to $200 billion. We're having our own report that'll be generated from the committee, and they'll move forward with recommendations. I believe they've had about 4 or 5 meetings thus far, but I think our healthcare needs are urgent and profound in the state. At the same time, you don't want to rush into anything and mess things up even worse than they are now.
When do you see your committee wrapping up its work?
I believe their final meeting is scheduled for March.
So if I might just mention something about your leadership style, which I've noticed and it's been very interesting, we talked about it a little bit last year, is that you've put a lot of emphasis on committee responsibilities and also on oversight, reintroduced that. And going into it this year, how are you thinking about, how that's working and what we should be looking for that might be different from what the legislative process, usual businesses.
Yeah,
like.
well, I mean, there's a couple of dynamics. And first of all, there's the extension term limits. The night I got elected in 2012, we all thought we were going to get elected to 6-year term limits, and we got elected to 12 years. And I think that's really opened the door to dig in and do things like oversight and accountability. In the past, members would get elected and they start thinking immediately about what's next. Oversight and accountability is not all that sexy. It's not necessarily going to get you elected to the next office. And I think that extension has allowed us to do that. The extension of term limits has also given, chairs the opportunity to be chairs, to develop a level of expertise. I managed a campaign in 2006 for a gentleman who served in the state legislature for 6 years. And the 6 years that he was here, he chaired banking for 2 years, transportation for 2 years, and business and professions for 2 years. And how anybody can develop any level of expertise at all in 2-year stints is just absurd. Think about would you want to open your mouth to a dentist who only was going to do that for 2 years? And I think this has given us sort of the opportunity to be policy experts in those fields. So for me, it just seemed to make sense to allow chairs to kind of dig in and own those policy areas.
As I think about oversight and accountability, one thing that comes to mind is the criminal justice system, more broadly, and our efforts to reduce the size of the prison population, which were required by the courts, that started in 2011. And how do you see the different efforts at criminal justice reform working right now? Where do you think we are with that?
Just with respect to corrections or the whole system?
The whole thing, and I know it's a big thing. We're talking for everything from racial justice issues to how the correction system is working to crime, but whatever element you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, I'm proud of it. I mean, first, generally with respect to oversight, I believe my chief of staff, Carrie Cornwell, is here, and every time I talk about oversight, she says, when you do oversight, you have to do oversight over somebody. And that somebody is always the executive branch. And I think if there's something I always want to commend the governor on and his team, it's that they've been very much open to that. They've been very much open to us, open to us sort of exercising that power that we have. With respect to the whole criminal justice system and public safety in general, I think it's what we've looked at as an institution is to make sure that we aren't sort of over penalizing people. We want to have a society that's safe, but also a society that's forgiving. The governor is someone who talks with great passion about the extent to which he thinks over sentencing was a mistake that he made in his first term. I think I'm very proud of what we've done in terms of criminal justice reform. The Department of Corrections, Mr. Kernan and I have had a lot of conversations about specifically what's happening in the prisons, and I think what we've been doing as a society, as a state, is reflective of the type of society we want to be. That being said, I go back to the district, and all of our members go back to the district in the fall, and we hear from our local elected officials about concerns that they have, and I think it's always important for us to make sure that we're attuned to those concerns.
And what do you think the next steps are in the criminal justice arena? What are we going to be seeing this year?
Bail reform. I think we as a society make it penalize those who are poor, and I think we need to do a better job. Other entities, other locales throughout the country have done a better job of addressing bail than we have.
And any other efforts around police community relations?
Yeah, I know our public safety chair, Reggie Jones Sawyer, has. Hello, Ms.
Hello.
Bates. How are you?
Hi, you guys.
Thank you. We haven't been talking about you hardly
Yeah,
at
at
all.
all.
Well, my ears were ringing, but
Yeah.
for the wrong reasons, believe me.
Okay.
How's the Senate?
Yeah. So,
Well, we adjourned, so that was good news.
That's
you
yeah,
know.
we were just finishing up a question on police community relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously policing tends to be a local function, but we've tried to create sort of guidelines and systems at the statewide level that allow locals to kind of do their job and have a certain level of autonomy. But we want to make sure that we have a certain degree of oversight over those issues as well.
Thank you. So let me take a moment to introduce, for those who don't know, Senator Patricia Bates, who is the Senate Republican leader. She's been in the leadership position now for almost a year, and is somebody I've known for many years because we overlapped in Orange County many years ago when, well, not that many years ago, but let's just say
It was
years
only
ago.
10 then,
That's
right,
right,
Mark?
exactly. And it's a pleasure to have you here. And yeah. Of course, we're all very curious to know what was going on in that Senate meeting, but maybe we can get to that. But I did want to give you a chance, as I did the speaker, to tell us what you think are the top two issues of most importance in this current legislative session, as you see it.
Well, thanks, Mark. May I respond very quickly to the question that Speaker Rendon just spoke to on the police community relations, because I think we did something that was very, very important in the County of Orange when I was on the Board of Supervisors. We had a lot of complaints from residents about harassment by law enforcement during a time when law enforcement in Orange County was really under the floodlights. So we created a process called the Police Community Relations, and it was voluntary on the part of law enforcement to participate when a resident complained about the way they were treated at a traffic stop, or when they were being accused of some crime of one sort or another. And they were very involved in developing the process and participating in it. And it was voluntary on the part of law enforcement. Well, we had a number of very good outcomes from that, and it was good for our residents to understand that when a law enforcement officer approaches you in the car It's always intimidating, and their approach to you needed to be one that was looking for an answer of why and letting you know what you did wrong versus immediately looking at you like you're the criminal who's going to attack them. And then on the part of the resident who might have been intimidated, wrong response, what they needed to do. But this happened in a setting where they could come together with a counselor, mediator, and it really, on both sides, gave more confidence, trust in the public that law enforcement was doing its duty, and on part of the law enforcement officer, it wasn't on their record. So it was a win-win, and it continues to this day, and from our sheriff at that time said that they had really we're very, very happy with the board taking that direction rather than going immediately to a police commission where everything becomes very public. It gets almost stilted in a very, I think, a rigid structure, so you can't have that person-to-person conversation. And I think we all know when you can have a person-to-person conversation with anyone that you've had some disagreement with and you can get it out of the way, it kind of restores trust in a relationship. So it's very, very, I think, very helpful, and it was very progressive in terms of the way we deal with those things in our community. Regarding the two most important issues, thought a lot about that. Certainly we've heard from our great governor and we've heard from our leaders that we still need a lot of work. A lot of work needs to be done. And I would say that has to focus on the cost of living in the state, the affordability issue. Affordability, cost of living affects every socioeconomic level in our state. We know that our very poor folks, they have to struggle just with the basics to get housing, food, health. Many are doubling up in homes, and that created a significant issue in my community where too many people in one home, and they were, unfortunately, with a fire, many of them lost their lives. But that was their choice so that they could continue to live here. Middle income, we see many of them being forced down to the poverty level into homelessness for the same very reasons. We have a very, very expensive state to live in. For those at the higher income level, they have discretionary income of a greater buying power when they're in another state. A house in certainly median cost of homes here, certainly in my area, is a little higher than $400,000. I think that's the range, but in Orange County, it's looking at about middle 500,000s. So they can go to Texas and get something, a great family home, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, all the things they need for their family for half that, and they have the discretionary income that they think is vital to their quality of life and that of their children. So that is a real issue. Accountability, I think it's extremely important that when we put proposals before our voters that we honor their request through their vote to approve those. Promises made have to be promises kept if we're to keep the trust with the voters of California. I give you a couple examples. I think there's been something in the news just yesterday regarding water storage from the water bonds. They were approved in 2014, and we see that there's already a bump in the road regarding the Governor's Commission on Water on whether those storage projects where they have put a lot of effort into proposing those may be stalled for a variety of reasons. I think that's something that, again, starts to break the trust with the folks. We had the school bond. In my district, we have a lot of housing being built. It's a new area. A lot of entitlements were granted, and those have gone forward, and it's like a land sale out there. I mean, they're snapping up those houses, even though we have mellow roofs in them. But the schools are lagging behind. Building schools that take care of that growing young population is really an issue. So with the school bonds, we still have not released enough money to meet those projects that have come forward on the timeline that was required with that bond. So those are a couple examples. I look at it, guys, as the glass half full. We have made progress, but there's another half that is lacking, and it's like going to the bakery and having them bake you a cake, and you go to pick it up and all they have in it is a piece, and you said, I wanted the whole cake, what happened? So those are the things we really have to pay attention to as we work together, and I think that the governor struck a note today that I really appreciated. He's talking about working together on all of these, and it's my hope that as we go forward in this year, and it's going to be a difficult challenge because it's an election year, but I want us to go forward with a real bipartisan spirit. We will disagree on how to get there, but my belief is we all want to get there. We want a great California. We do not want to see our people in poverty. I was a social worker. I know what it's like in the ghetto. I know what it's like in the projects. I walked those some 25 years ago as a young college student, just out of college, got my job. I could not believe that people who are just 5 or 6 years younger than me had no life in front of them, no opportunity to move out of poverty. So I am very passionate about that, and we need to be looking at programs that work. I think the latest studies show that private sector programs are working a lot better than government programs, even though we put a lot of money into it and we believe in it. And it isn't that, that's the wrong thing to do. We just have to find the right way to make all of that work. And so those are the things that I will really be focused on as we go forward. And again, in election year, we can have our battles, I think, out at the campaign forums, the candidate forums, and we can talk about whether he's a better candidate or I'm the better candidate. But I do think in the House of the People, we really have to join hands, and it has to be more bipartisan. Republicans must be part of the discussion, the conversation. Whether we're the super minority or the minority, it doesn't matter who has that position. They represent in Senate districts 1 million people. And that's extremely important. I want to hear from all those people, whether they're R's or D's or whatever, because they help me do the right thing for the reasons they sent me here.
Thank you, Senator. And Senator de León, welcome. You have been the Senate Pro Tem since 2014, represent a district in Los Angeles. You've been on the stage with me before at this time of year. Of course, we're all curious and eager to learn what just went on during this hour that the speaker and I were having a tremendous conversation here. But first, I'd like to hear from you, because I know that you need to leave at 1. You have a hard stop because of a flight you have to take. Is that correct? Yeah, that's what I'm told. Well, if I'm wrong, somebody correct me, but give us a sense of your top 1 or 2 issues.
There's a ton of issues. What I would say is I think one of the top issues right now is to obviously do everything within our power to defend our incredible gains in California, working very closely with Speaker Anthony Rendon, working very closely with our Chief Executive, Governor Jerry Brown. I think by any objective measure, what we have accomplished together is the envy of the nation. I would challenge anyone here to name one legislative body in the country, any other state, or including that, Washington, D.C. I would even go further, even when the Democrats were in control of Washington. I don't think anyone has accomplished the things that we have, the most far-reaching climate change policies in the world, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, equal pay for equal work for women, gun safety and ammunition regulation. The list goes on and on. The job growth that has been created as a result of our clean energy policies, extending the cap and trade program, as well as extending the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. These are incredible gains that are measurable and quantifiable, verifiable, that we have accomplished together. That being said, they're under attack, either through statutory measures in the Congress or through executive actions, regulatory actions in the regulatory space with the administration. So I do think that we have to defend our immigrant population. We have to defend our policies that promote clean air and clean water and deal with carbon dioxide as well as other criteria pollutants. At the same time, economic growth and jobs. We have to defend our immigrants. We've seen the onslaught of the threats that have been made by the Department of Justice just lately, the conversations of subpoenas being made to elected officials, or when you have an interim ICE director under Homeland Security that have made very veiled threats to certain elected officials, on this stage present, that he wants them arrested and to see if they can figure out through Homeland Security what is the legal constitutional language that they could utilize to justify the arrest, if you will, of individuals who stand in their way to protect immigrant families. So I think that's one issue, is how do we defend, the incredible gains that we have made in California. Same time, I think that I'm sure that Speaker Rendon probably articulated, and as well as Senate Republican leader Patty Bates, a whole variety of issues that are still very important. I think that 100% clean energy is very critical. The issue with regards to tax policy, and the most egregious tax policy in the history of the United States of America, where a lot of Californians will be double taxed as a result, because we are a donor state. Every dollar that we send to Washington, we receive less pennies on the dollar in comparison with other very deep red states, whether it's Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and North Dakota, Kansas, elsewhere. They're receiving much more money than they send to Washington. So what we do in California does matter, in a bipartisan fashion. Working with Patty Bates, for me, it's been a joy to work with Patty Bates. We have a very respectful relationship. But the policies that we have moved forward, we have to defend under statutory as well as regulatory actions. Just recently, the FCC on the issue of net neutrality. That's another issue. Ideally, net neutrality should be a uniformed federal policy, but the reality is that has been upended completely altogether. And that is not a Democrat or Republican issue. It's not a partisan issue. This is an issue for all Americans to have access to a space that's always been egalitarian. It has been free. It has been open. That's how we do business. That's how we communicate with each other. That's how we engage with each other. So these are really critical issues. There's a lot more that we can go on, but I think those are some of the critical issues.
I'm told that you actually have 10 minutes. Do you have another 10 minutes with us that you could stay? And I know that the speaker doesn't, and there are a couple of things that we'd like to cover. So whenever you need to go, we'll go.
But I'm not going to find out what happened in the Senate.
No, we're going to find out right now. We're going to ask right now.
I already texted to you.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Please move over. Yeah.
Ryan.
Thank you. Yeah. So, tell us what happened in the Senate first, and then...
I'm going to let him tell you what happened, and then I'm going to tell you
Okay.
what we need to defend,
Okay, very good.
Oh, we just had some internal housekeeping duties to take care
Oh,
of. That's
okay.
all. You'll read it in the newspaper.
So one thing that I did want to mention that the speaker and I spoke about, because he listed it as one of his top two issues, was sexual harassment and how the legislature is handling the issue, both process-wise and culture. And I think all of us would like to hear from both of you.
Well, let me take that issue on first, head on, as the leader of the Senate. This is a very serious issue, and this is an issue that I believe strongly in the Senate that we take very seriously. When we received a letter from the Me Too and We Said Enough coalition here in Sacramento, I do believe that the Senate acted very swiftly. In that I don't believe to date there's a legislative body in the country, including Washington, that has moved forward with an independent investigative body. In this case, we've contracted with Van de Meiden Maddox, as well as our other law firm, I'm escaping the name right now, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher now, as well as Van de Meiden Maddox, handle all sexual misconduct allegations. That is out of the arm of the Senate. Therefore, there's no political influence. They handle all of the allegations. Secondly, we set up a 1-800 hotline, which we believe is important to sort of create a culture that a staffer, but especially a female staffer, would feel safe and be able to call and make a complaint, free of any type of political retribution of any sort. Thirdly, I've contracted with two nonprofit agencies, specifically CalCasa as well as Weave, and they specialize in trauma victims to provide any psychotherapeutic services that may be needed if someone wants to access them. I think these are very proactive steps that we're moving forward. It is an extraordinary step for any legislative body to outsource, if you will, their own internal investigative body. Since the founding of the Republic in 1849 and then being admitted to the nation in 1850, these types of institutions have sort of not been conducive and open and transparent when it comes to the issues of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. I can say, the Congress, I think just a few months ago, the Congress barely implemented mandatory sexual harassment training. Mandatory sexual harassment, barely for the first time in its history since the founding of the nation. So I think the steps that we made are quite extraordinary. Ultimately, it's going to be about cultural change, systemic, that's sustainable, and that hopefully will be in perpetuity long, after I'm gone as a leader of this institution. But I'm hoping that I leave my successor with some really deep reforms that ultimately will change the culture in this institution and that will allow for an environment for any staffer, but in particular female staffers who have disproportionately been impacted by sexual misconduct, that allow them to advance, allow them to move forward with their careers, allow them to engage with anyone they want to engage with, free from any type of sexual harassment, but even worse, if there is sexual harassment, political retribution that stunts, that truncates, sabotages, their viability to have gainful employment and vertical mobility within the institution.
Senator Bates.
I don't know. I have, yeah. What we learned yesterday, I'm on the subcommittee of the Joint Rules, where we will be looking at what's the structure going forward, what are the processes going to be to ensure that we do have a policy that builds trust and has consequences. And what was a very interesting lead-in comment by an expert in how to develop a real good HR sexual harassment policy is that culture trumps policy. You have to start with changing the culture. That is probably the most difficult task we're going to have, Kevin, because culture it's a very deliberative process, a very longer process, and people are calling for something more quick. A quick answer, a quick
Give me a sense
outcome.
of what changing culture means, Senator Bates.
It means where you build in trust with the policies that are there, that they are responsive, they are fair, they give due process, and they have just consequences. That will probably be the most difficult in determining a continuum of consequences based on what the offense was. And we will come with that once we have that structure. But we anticipate 3 to 4 more meetings initially to get to the bottom of the definitions and how you build that into a structure. And then we will be presenting those findings to the Rules Committee, the Joint Rules Committee as a whole, and they will, with recommendations, they will determine how to go forward, and then it will be taken to the whole body.
Is this an issue where we have bipartisan agreement, or is this an issue in which there are differences of opinions about definitions, processes, culture, and so forth?
I did not feel that in the conversations in that committee yesterday, and it was open to the public, and I believe that the presentations by the experts are on the website, so all of you can take a look at that. We certainly welcome input from the public, but I do believe if we've had a bipartisan commission going forward, this one is it. And I want to commend Kevin for calling immediately for that third-party law team to do the investigations, to take it out of the legislature and to encourage, I think, that we are working with the Assembly so we have a consistent process and structure going forward. So it's not that house and our house doing things quite different. So immediately you undermine the trust with that. So it was a good meeting. It's going to be very labor intensive, absolutely. to get where we want to go.
Can I add something too? Because I think that, when you make systematic changes, when you try to make comprehensive processes, reforms that are necessary to be in place, that are transparent and they're uniform, that's what we're in the process of doing, and actually that's what we've done already. But the culture is really critical. I can say a handful of folks who are real veterans of this institution and predate our presence as elected officials. So they have either witnessed or heard the stories at Simon's or any other bar in this institution of all the sordid stories that have happened across the street. Let's be honest and be frank, there's a ton of it, and that's been sort of glorified, if you will, by columnists, what have you, et cetera, And so everyone was kind of like a willing participant, let's be truthful, of this culture of money, of power, of lobbyists, of sex, and all that kind of stuff that goes with it for decades and decades and decades. And many folks, never felt safe. They didn't want to say anything. And it's ultimately about culture. And quite truthfully, we can systematically make the changes, which we are, but it's going to have to be men changing, if we're going to change culture, because the vast perpetrators of discrimination and harassment and sexual misconduct are in fact men. They are the vast majority of the perpetrators, and the victims are women. So ultimately, it's going to have to be men who help forge and change that culture too. Because if not, we can create all the systems that we want that are put in place. And folks who are victims of harassment will hopefully make their complaints, but we will not change culture. And culture ultimately is something that's long, it's going to take longer to change, but we have to change because this is an issue that's societal. Mm-hmm. We've seen it already. It's in journalism. We've seen it already. It's in politics. It's in the private sector. It's in tech. It's in the lobbying corps. It is nonprofit world. It is societal issue, and we all have to rise together. But especially men have to stand up and take responsibility and help lead this as well too.
So because of your schedules, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have questions from the audience, but I do want to leave with with each of you with one question.
5 minutes.
Okay, good. So maybe we'll take a couple of questions then too. But let me ask you if you heard anything from the governor this morning that gave you pause for thought about what the agenda is going to be for 2018 for the legislature.
Right now, we've accomplished a lot in the past 4 or 5 years. We've accomplished a lot, and I'm going to put it out there. By any objective measure, we had some incredible leaders in the past, a lot of folklore. I would put our accomplishments in the past 5 years to anyone, any legislative body in the state of California, including the nation, of what we've accomplished. We have to now execute those policies. They can't be measures that we got all the fanfare and they're trophy measures. We have to execute those policies now in the regulatory body, in the executive branch. We have to follow through. Patty made reference to accountability, making sure, are the monies getting to where they need to be? Or is the money being spent in an efficient manner? Is it not being spent in an efficient manner? Is the money not being put out there? What's the reasons why? So there's a lot of that type of work that has to be done. It's not just we're going to move another bill, we're going to move that bill. I know there's a lot of folks who don't like us moving a bunch of bills. And I do believe we don't have to be running bills ad nauseum consistently, because we move some of the most profound measures, policies that we're going to have to follow through and make sure they're executed in the right way.
So one thing that I heard from the speaker and from Senator Bates was about accountability and oversight. So it sounds like you would agree with that more than new bills, but Senator Bates.
I actually listened to the governor very intently because he is truly a cheerleader for the state. He loves the state, and I think that just oozes from him and feels that we are on the right track. I guess my caution would be with a glass half full analysis is when he says there's a lot to be done, there is a lot to be done. And when we are on the wrong course, that we need to do a course correction and not feel somehow we failed in what we set out to do. I will share with you my concern about one thing we did last year that supposedly is the key to eliminating poverty in the state, the minimum wage. What I'm finding, and I'm sure some of you are very aware of this, the minimum wage increase is really harming the restaurant industry. And because of that, restaurants are closing, people are losing their jobs. These are good jobs, by the way, because they pay the minimum wage, they also pay tips. So we have to find a way to balance when we are raising the revenue, the income from taxpayers on this side, we reduce the regulations on them. That's a course correction as far as I'm concerned. It's not undoing a great policy to try to lift people out of poverty, give them a higher standard of living, giving them more discretionary income. We have a resistance to take a look at policies that we've put in place that really need a course correction. We don't need to beat up on the high-speed rail. It is, you know, mushrooming in cost. But the governor said something today that was very positive about really improving the hubs, the transportation hubs that we have, electrifying what we can. And that certainly is something very important for Los Angeles, very important for Orange County, taking a look at those things. So I don't think we should ever feel that somehow we failed because something's not working the way we thought it was. I think we need to step up with the courage, bipartisan, and say we need a course correction and let people weigh in on that. To me, that's the way we live our lives. You know, as parents, you all know, you start down that path with your child and somehow they want to go this way. Well, I wanted you to be a doctor, and I will tell you, Senator Wynn is a great example. Her parents wanted her to be a doctor, and she decided with the love of this country and her opportunities here, she wanted to be part of the government in setting policies that made America the place that she was attracted to, was able to come here and have an incredible quality of life that she wouldn't have had in her home country. To me, that's the kind of course corrections we need to look at. We're over here, can we move here? Do we have to move way over here? And not be apologetic about it, say it's for the good of the people we serve.
Question from the audience. Anybody have a question? In the interest of time, short question. Thank you.
Yes, Jeff. Kevin, you got a battle there to do. You're going to have to go negative if you're going to get into the federal government. But what do you think you're going to leave the state of California with?
Okay.
What am I going to leave the state of California with? In terms of...
Microphone.
If you are referring to a legacy, or
I guess
that's a hard question.
Yeah, okay.
I would just say, listen, there's a couple things I think I'm proud of. The issue with regards to Senate Bill 1234, the California Secure Choice, it's a new financial product, retirement security. 7 million Californians have no access to defined benefit or defined contribution at their place of employment, which means sometime this year, end of this year, we're going live. Which means if you're a Californian at your place of employment and you have no defined benefit or defined contribution, you're going to be automatically enrolled. You can opt out, but you're automatically enrolled in this retirement security plan, and also it is automatic payroll deduction as well too. So this is the reason why is that we have, of our senior citizens who live in poverty today in California, 2/3 of them are women. 2/3 of senior citizens who live in poverty today are women. And I think it's a shame that women who brought us into this world, who fed us, who clothed us, who raised us, retire into poverty only when their arms or backs or shoulders physically give out. And these are not individuals who can go to a Charles Schwab store or T. Rowe Price and go look at the menu of all the financial products, IRA, Roth IRA, 529s, et cetera, 401k plans, and just access a product. And we're not that literate when it comes to finances. Those who have a high educational attainment, but even with high educational attainment, a lot of folks don't, prepare for the future. This is automatic enrollment. So I think this is going to be really exciting.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And Senator de León, Senator Bates, thank you so much for coming over here after taking care of your housekeeping
I know it was crazy.
duties.
I apologize.
Thank you. And I want to thank Donna for being part of our program today, our 2018 sponsors for making it possible to have programs like this one, all of you for coming out and asking good questions and thinking about these important issues, and have a wonderful day. Thanks.